Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the final episode review for the final season of Game of Thrones. It is season 8, episode 6, titled The Iron Throne, which seems rather appropriate considering what happens in the episode and considering what has this whole show been about, if not capturing and keeping the Iron Throne or keeping the Iron Throne. And yes, once again, we have quite the divisive episode when it comes to internet reactions and fandom reactions and all of those things. Just very briefly, if you want my overall kind of feelings about the episode, I don't hate it. I don't really like it a lot. It's kind of in the middle lukewarm area for me, but we'll get into all of that right now. Once again, this episode picks up right after the previous episode. We are literally in the aftermath of the burning of King's Landing. I guess that's what you can call it. The smoldering ashes of what's left of King's Landing and what soldiers are left, what people are left. It's kind of a mess there right now, and what ended up happening is that essentially just things went kind of crazy at the end of the last episode, and Daenerys is now kind of in her full power trip mode, if you will, in her full authoritative mode. And what we see here is a very slow, somber moments at the beginning of this episode and throughout it, which was really interesting to me because I thought things would move a little more quickly considering it is the last episode and you have a lot of things to wrap up and all these kinds of things. And they decided to take a more slower approach to things where there's a lot of people walking around, there's a lot of dialogue happening, there's a lot of, speeches and maneuverings happening. And what's interesting to me is that now wasn't the time for this. It really wasn't. Now was the time not for so much reflection, but for action. But that seems to happen a lot with throughout the entire series of Game of Thrones, where the biggest event happens in the second to last episode of the season, and then the final episode of the season is kind of the aftermath, or where do we go from here, or recovering or setting up things for the following season. And obviously there's nothing to set up because this is the final episode, but what we get here is Tyrion just walking through the rubble, just really rethinking his life at the moment, I assume, or at least his recent life plans when it came to supporting Daenerys, because he definitely chose the wrong path, because she did the exact opposite of what he wanted her to do or what he thought she was going to do. The same thing with Jon. John's another one who's kind of in a flux or in a daze about what is going on or what just occurred. And what is interesting is that they don't really know how to deal with it right away initially. Tyrion's taking it all in. He's going through the rubble and he's going down to the catacombs to see if his brother and sister made it out. Probably more specifically, his brother. And when he gets down there, he finds their bodies and he mourns for them, or at least he mourns for his brother, I think. More so. Obviously, if you've been following the show all along, you understand the relationship between Tyrion and Jamie and how strong that bond was. And he mourns for them. But what I find very interesting about that whole sequence, while it is very powerful for the character and it's a powerful moment in the show in general, two of the main characters who've been with us from the first episode are literally they're dead. That's their end. W- It's a little weird to me, and this may be nitpicky to me, and please forgive me if you find that it is, but when we saw them die, or at least we assumed how they died, was the whole ceiling and everything just collapsed on them. What we saw in the shot that they literally used in the previous episode was that the roof was caving in behind them and it was just falling like a waterfall, like a wave coming towards them, and then covered the whole screen. But when Tyrion gets down there seems to be a little pile of rubble where their dead bodies are, and then the rest of the cavern seems a bit vacant. That's kind of a continuity error to me. It's a bit of a frustrating thing because I would have expected for there at least to be more rubble. Like, I wanted Tyrion to be, like, climbing over rocks to see what happened. To me, it looked like if they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, which, they literally were, but they literally were in the wrong place, inside of the wrong place at the wrong time. That was a little bothersome. Yet again, it's a little nitpicky to me. I don't know. It just there's small things like that that bother me, I think, in this episode, and I'll get to that. So moving on from there, Tyrion no longer wants to be the hand of the queen. He can no longer support her, so he decides to take his pin and throw it away. Immediately, she's going to be. Immediately, she locks him up, and this comes right after one of her most powerful speeches, probably in the entire series, and it's a frightening speech. It's very totalitarian. It's very, some would say fascist if we're getting all, socio-political on us here. But she's basically saying that, we took King's Landing and we're not going to stop here because we're going to go to Lannisport. We're going to go to Winterfell. We're going to go everywhere. And basically, she's saying if they don't bend the knee like they didn't do here, we're going to level it and we're going to take it over. And I know John and Tyrion's heard this. They don't speak Dothraki or the Unsullied language, but they assumed that it wasn't good news. Just from the sheer demeanor of the way she was talking and the way she was acting, they didn't dictate that this was going to be a peaceful transition to power or ascent to power. And what essentially occurred is that their allegiances are now broken. They're tattered, or at least Tyrion's is. Jon is still fluctuating, and what is interesting is where this goes from here. Tyrion is put away. Jon goes sees him. Oh, or initially, actually, Jon meets Arya, and Arya pretty much she says she knows that Daenerys is now to a point of no return when it comes to being a bad person or an active killer or something like that. She can kind of gauge people and how their demeanor dictates their actions. And what's very interesting to me is that John now goes and meets Tyrion. They have this really interesting conversation about allegiances and loyalty and decision making and what is morally right versus not morally right, what is at this point treasonous and what is not. And Tyrion's basically telling him, she's an extremist now. She is not going to stop. This is only the start of something that could go terribly bad. And basically he tells John, you know what you have to do. Can you do it? Will you do it? Ultimately, John does end up doing what Tyrion, I believe, suggested, and kind of what Varys suggested, an episode or two ago. Varys ended up being right. He knew that this was going to happen. I mean, he kind of predicted it, and and Tyrion didn't listen to him. You know what I mean? And they ended up getting Varys ended up getting killed because of it. And so John, they have John and Danny have this scene together. It's very powerful. It's very meaningful, and it's very similar to the scenes that they've had before, professing their love for one another, their connection with one another. But John is at this point pleading with her to not go down this road that she's going to go on. He's just without coming right out and saying it that you can't do this, that I can't follow you down this road. He does everything but says that. And what he ends up doing, he ends up, kissing her even in love and then stabbing her while he's kissing her. It's very Shakespearean. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Romeo and Juliet, sort of, but it's very tragic in a Shakespearean sense. And what ends up happening is that Drogon doesn't see it happen, but he kind of swoops in afterward because he's kind of perched out there, and all he sees is his mother, Daenerys, dead, and John's there. He gets very upset. Well, first he initially goes over and checks up on her. It's a very sad scene for a lot of reasons because it's not only there's a parental connection between Daenerys and Drogon and her dragons in general, and it's a mother son relationship versus, like a human pet relationship. It's very similar to the way in which John and Ghost had a very connected relationship. It wasn't, a parenting type thing, but it was a bond. There was a bond there, and the dragon, I guess, feels that loss or feels that bond that's severed now. And we initially think he's going to take it out on John and blast him with fire. That would have been very interesting. A lot of people are wondering what would have happened had John been blasted with fire. Since he is a Targaryen, is he resistant to it? What would have happened, essentially. I'm not quite sure what would have happened. It would have been interesting, but that's not what happened. Instead, Drogon decides to blast the Iron Throne and basically melt it down to, liquid metal, molten nothing, just a blob of nothing. And a lot of people had problems with that because while for me, and I think from a storytelling perspective, and for I think many people are taking it this way, it's extremely symbolic. It's very poetic. It says a lot more than just blasting John would have. But it also makes us beg the question: is how conscious and how aware were the dragons this whole time to what was going on? Did they understand the concept of the throne and what the throne meant? Did they understand Danny's quest at all, or not? And it makes you beg the question, in- you know, is this something they're just forcing in now, or is it something that's been here all along? I can't really answer that. I don't know. It could be another forced writing thing. It could not. But either way, it showed that Drogon, at least from the most part, understood that the throne was the cause of his mother's death. It was also, you could extrapolate that outward even more, saying it was the cause of Danny's death in general. You could say that her quest for the throne consumed her to the point where she lost a bit of her humanity and she lost a lot of that goodness and that heart that a lot of people saw in her throughout the series, which is what a lot of people have been commenting on when it came to her, ultimate turn towards this more darker, more sinister, serious version of Danny. This angry Mad Queen version is she lost her humanity at some point, and her humanity was lost in this quest for this throne, and ultimately this throne is just a hunk of metal. It's what they gave value to. It is what made it important, and that seems to be something that you can extrapolate to real life as well. The things we have around us, money, cars, houses, material things, are only valuable because we give them value. And the throne is the same way. So basically, from what I can understand after this point, is Jon is taking into custody for killing Daenerys because Drogon flies away with the body. And I'm assuming he confessed because nobody saw this happen. Not even the dragon who reacted to it so violently. But I guess he must have turned himself in. I mean, he obviously didn't lie and say she flew away. Perhaps people saw her body being flown away and they assumed that she had died. I don't know. They don't really go into that. And it's kind of frustrating because it's kind of just leaving the contextual information up in the air. But yet again, as we've seen from the last few episodes, they don't have time to put all this stuff in. We kind of have to make these leaps for ourselves. But whatever, that's kind of the way it goes. And what we can also assume is that it leapt forward a significant amount of time because we saw that both Jon and Tyrion are now haggard. They both have beards. They both have that, I've been locked up for a long time weariness to them. they both they both feel like they've been locked up for a while. And Tyrion is taken out of prison to be brought to this council of all of the leaders of Westeros. At least all the leaders that are left alive after these series of wars that have happened. And what is interesting is that you got to see characters that you haven't seen in a while, so you're not really sure who they are, and you get to see characters that you may have never seen before. It's very, very interesting who's left when it comes to all the leaders of the houses and who was able to come back to reprise their roles. We have all the Lords of the Vale, including young Robin, who looks much older than he was before, and we also have, of course, Yara, who's now the last living Greyjoy, from what we understand. You also, of course, have Sansa and Arya's there. There's actually representatives from Dorne there, which surprised the heck out of me because we haven't seen anything from Dorne since last season, and the last thing we remember is, was it one of the Sand Snakes and her daughter in the prison in the Red Keep or someplace like that? They kind of just didn't follow up on that at all. So I'm assuming they're dead. They weren't there. I'm assuming they're dead. Um, and I'm not even sure who the representative from Dorne was. Please excuse me. I'm not sure. I thought everyone was dead from Dorne so far. I should have done my research, but I didn't. So if I'm making a mistake, please tell me because I would like to know who they put in as representative from Dorne. It's very interesting now that Bronn did end up getting uh, his his uh, his castle of High Garden, which is a pretty big role for him. But what is very interesting at this council, what it ultimately decides is who is the new king or queen. There could have been a new queen as instead of a king, but there was a new king chosen. And what's interesting is the way in which it came about. I have more problems than I think who they ultimately chose. If that makes any sense to any of you out there, I'm not a big fan of who they chose, but the way in which they went about it was odd to me. I mean, the rationale behind it made some sense, but overall, let me try to unbox this. So basically, they asked Tyrion, "Who would you think is king? Would you be king?" And they kind of shrug that off. No, Sam has this idea where basically he wants to form like a democracy, and they all laugh that off because no voting here. Basically, uh, they decide that to make Bran king, but Tyrion's speech is essentially Bran has the best story or the best myth behind him, if you will. He has all the knowledge and understanding of Westeros's past and its present, and I guess we could also maybe assume its future. I mean, yet again, we still don't really know the full extent to Bran's powers and identity. That was something that was never really fully explored. We got some of it, but was that really it? He can just see visions and you know take control of animals, things like that. Is that the full extent? We're never really quite sure. But what we do know is he's now the new king of Westeros because he has the best story, because he's the wisest of them, and because he's the one who probably wanted it the least other than John. And it bothers me because this whole time, the way they chose to portray the character of Bran from the time he became the Three-Eyed Raven up until literally this episode, he wanted nothing to do with the world in this manner, the political world, this battle and these fights. The only thing he was really there for was to tell people, you know, certain things, certain important things that he chose to tell them, but he never like he never when when it was told to him that he's the new, head of House Stark and he's the last, the eldest Stark heir, he said, I'm not Bran Stark anymore. I'm the Three-Eyed Raven. I don't want for anything anymore. He's above the material world. But yet, when it came down to him being asked if he wanted to be the king, he said, I may be quoting, I may be paraphrasing, please excuse if I get it wrong. Why do you think I came all this way? And I'm like, what are you referring to? Came all this way from Winterfell, or came all this way from his literal journey throughout the series was to get him to this point? And and there's just no framework for it. And there's not really any framework or any backstory quite to it because the Three-Eyed Raven is not a political figure. He was a figure who lived out above the wall and was part of nature. He was not part of the human world to a certain extent. Some of that stuff kind of bothers me, but they wrote the show in such a way, at least to this point, where Bran, I guess, was the most interesting pick. Sansa was a fan favorite. I know she would have been a great queen, but I still don't think she wanted that. I don't think what she wanted, at least from last season and most heavily this season, is she wanted justice for the North. She wanted the North to be restored and be safe. That was her key priority. And as long as she got that, she didn't want the throne, and she ended up getting that. The North is now its own separate kingdom, like it used to be, way back when. And now Bran is the king of the six kingdoms, and the six kingdoms, not the seven, or the six realms and not the seven, or whatever it's called, syntax being what it is or semantics being what they are. But that's very interesting, but that was not enough for Grey Worm and the Unsullied to be satisfied. They wanted, justice for Daenerys. They ultimately want something to happen. Um, what ends up happening is Tyrion gets being be made Hand of the King again, which he was way back when, and he also gets to be, put back into a position of power like he was before. He was the Hand of the King early on in the series, Hand of the Queen. He seems to be failing upwards throughout the series in certain moments. He's had a rocky up and down journey for the character, and basically it's more of indentured servitude for him than it is a choice. This is basically his punishment, is to serve the realm forever until he dies, essentially. What is happening with John is that John now goes back to the Night's Watch, and as he so interestingly put it, there's still a Night's Watch. And that was a question I had myself as well. There's no longer a threat from beyond the wall, so I guess the whole thing with the Night's Watch is it's just a safe haven for bastards and people who have no other place to go. Essentially, they have no other, you know, home, basically. It's very interesting how he ends up back there, and I'm a little bittersweet about that whole scenario. I'm bittersweet because, on one hand, and this may be a little long diatribe, on one hand, I felt his character journey had moved him past being part of the Night's Watch. Him being part of the Night's Watch served for creating and molding his character and ultimately setting him on a bigger, larger path that we've been seeing now for the past 3 seasons or so, ever since he died and came back from the dead, which is a significant moment in the series, and it takes a little luster out of it now, where we see where he ultimately ends up is back where he ultimately started. It's cyclical in his journey, so you have that from a kind of hero's journey or character perspective. But yet again, I feel like it's a little regressive. It's regressive for his character to go back to where he was before. Now, does it suit him to a certain extent? Yes, one can make that argument. One can make the argument that he never felt more like himself or felt more at home than he was during his time at the Night's Watch. Specifically, when he was beyond the wall, I think is when he learned a lot about himself. That is when we got to see a lot of his character development. And now that he's back there, that's ultimately where he's his happiest. He gets reunited with Ghost, which is fantastic. He gets reunited with Tormund Giantsbane, who's, a close friend. He gets reunited with the Wildlings, and for some reason they go beyond the wall, and I'm not quite sure why. I understand that that is their home. That is where they came from. That's their main place. But they have that whole section of the north now to be there. They don't have to live beyond the wall. There's better land below the wall that they could settle in and whatnot. And they're still significantly north. It I don't know, it was just, I guess, done for poeticism and to close out the character, but I kind of really wanted to see John become the king. If that was someone I was rooting for, I think it was him, because he's someone who came back for a reason. He died and was brought back. There were people, on the internet who were saying maybe he was the prince that was promised. I think that's something Melisandre said, or even someone said that, Daenerys was the princess that was promised. What happened with that whole prophecy type thing? that kind of gets a little muddled here. Was John's greater purpose for coming back was to stop Daenerys from becoming a tyrant? But in a way, him coming back led to her becoming a tyrant. You know what I mean? So what are we doing here when it comes to long-term writing? Also, John's lineage was very, very important. It was a huge twist slash bombshell they dropped on us at the end of last season, a big monumental revelation. And ultimately, all it ended up doing was creating all of the problems with Daenerys that led to her having to be killed. So in a way, I guess they were writing that long term, but I kind of wanted more from it. If you're gonna drop something that's that gigantic, historical within the world of Game of Thrones, it's got to pay off a little harder than that, at least for me. Also, John, I guess, is the last living Targaryen. I mean, yeah, I guess in the lore, there is some Targaryen blood mixed in with the Dornish blood, if you look at some of the history of the Game of Thrones world. But I guess in the show, John is the last of the Targaryens, and it did reach a point where lineage did not matter at all, where it didn't matter who had the better stake to the throne, who had the better, closeness and bloodlines and all that kind of stuff. And what is also interesting to me, going back to this, council of powerful people, is they were about to go to war with one another at some point. Like they were able to agree on anything, assumedly. Because the Unsullied would have gone to war if John was released, if Tyrion was released. I don't think Tyrion had a chance of getting released, but if John was released and, the Northmen would have gone to war had John not been released. So they came to the conclusion of having Bran as the king very, very quickly with a kind of pseudo argument from Tyrion that I thought was a little weak for me. And it's interesting, where you look at all the people there where their allegiance lies. The only ones who probably wouldn't have agreed that Bran was to be king would have been, you know, Yara Greyjoy. That may have been it. The Lords of the Vale have always been loyal to the Starks, so they would have gone that way. Um, Bronn, I guess, could have just been bought either way, but he was already bought as it is. Um, um, the West, Sansa and Arya would have said yay. So it really all came down to, I guess, like who was the one who wanted it in that moment. What is interesting is that Edmure Tully, who made a resurgence out of nowhere, decided to get up and make a play for the throne. And of course, they wasted time on having him give like a little minute or two long speech. And of course, he's still just an all talking windbag. He's not really someone who has any real integrity or any real worth. But I guess he's back at River Run, so that kind of closes that loop when it comes to the Tullys. It's very interesting how quickly that whole thing wrapped up. Yet again, some things that I did like I said, the John thing was bittersweet. I really loved how Sansa ended her character arc. Sansa got, like I said, exactly what she wanted. She got peace for the North. She got independence for the North. She got justice for the North to a certain extent. Yeah, she pretty much got justice for the North. And she basically said that out of all these things that have happened, there was no way the North was going to trust anyone from the South again. And that's pretty much true. And she got named Queen of the North in a great, fantastic, powerful moment for her character. That was awesome. A lot of people did not like what happened with Arya, and I have to say, that's kind of the most logical thing that could happen to her. At least one can make that argument, is because all of her kill list is now dead. All of her kill list and all of her quest and her training that led up to this moment, or led up to these last few actions that she did throughout the series, when it came to getting justice for the Stark family with the phrase, when it came to fighting, of course, the Battle of Winterfell, when it came to Cersei dying. Cersei also ended up dying, as well as the Hound, who I don't think she was ever going to kill anyways. But where does she go from here? Like we saw in an earlier episode, she's not a lady. She's not someone who's going to sit in a castle and be, a proper noblewoman or anything like that. She's nomadic. She is an adventurer. She is someone who is independent of certain things. So her going west or her leaving Westeros, I think made the most sense because she already went to Essos with Bravos. She's been all over Westeros as we've seen throughout the series, and I guess her only place to go now is west. What bothered me a little bit is like when she asked what is west of Westeros. Well, there are maps, and they show that there are indeed lands west of Westeros. They're already discovered. She's not playing, explorer here or anything like that. They're on a map already. I believe the lands of Ashai are there. That's kind of where Melisandre, I believe, came from. So there's stuff there. What's interesting is that Euron Greyjoy, who they horribly underwritten, actually just returned from there. He spent many, many years, traveling that area of the world, but yet again, they just underwrit his character into the ground. So I kind of like what they did from her perspective. Has she ever shown an inkling for wanting to sail or go west? Not really, but she's nomadic, she's independent, and that works for her. Also, when it comes to some of the other characters, I like where they ended up as well. Sir Davos is now the master of ships. He's part of all the people who were part of the small council. I kind of liked. Although, let me get this out of the way first. I like that Sir Davos is now master of ships. That makes sense. Um, Brienne is the captain of the Kingsguard, taking over for Jamie. That kind of makes sense. You saw a what I thought was a great scene of her writing in all of Jamie's deeds up until his death. It shows her sense of character and her sense of being able to not take one moment of someone's life and have it define them. It was a very interesting way that their characters kind of departed, and it wasn't the best way that their characters could have departed. And like we've already mentioned how regressive that was for the Jamie character in terms of writing, and I thought it was very nice of her to do that for him. Granted, she could have not done it, and I don't think some people would have been fine with it. But I like to see that she's captain of the King's Guard. She's now a knight. Sir Podrick is also part of the King's Guard as well. That makes a lot of sense. I like to see that Samwell Tarly is now the Archmaester of King's Landing. Granted, he never finished his education as a maester, so I guess he just got appointed over it anyways. He didn't need to take those classes. He already knew the stuff anyways. Um, um, one of the funniest ones for me is they made Braun Master of Coin, and I don't know why. I guess they had to keep him happy or something like that. He already has Highgarden. But yeah, Master of Coin, he's someone who doesn't know how to handle money well. I mean, his main concern was resurrecting the brothels that were burned down during the battles. You know what I mean? That was his thing. But that was very interesting how that was set up and how it was played for comedy and also a sense of like, look how far these characters have come, look how far their journeys have gone and where they are now. Very, very interesting. Yeah, it was not the finale I think a lot of people wanted. I don't think it was the final season a lot of people wanted. And I know a lot of people are giving the creators and the showrunners a lot of grief for it. And I understand why. David Benioff and DB Weiss, they didn't do the best job that I think they could have done, but I don't think they did a terrible job. I think they ultimately hurt themselves by saying that they could close out the show in 12 episodes. They should have taken the full 20 or done it in 16 or 18 or something like that, because it showed how difficult it was to write the end of this series. I don't pity them at all. I don't envy them at all given the task to do it. I don't think it's a task I would have done for myself. I would have taken on myself. And I know there are a lot of people out there who said, "Oh, I could have written this better. I could have done that better." Sure, but we're not in their shoes. We don't know the full context of what it is like to be in charge of the show, what the production is like. They spent 2 years working on this final season when it came to production all the way from the beginning all the way till the end, and it was a hell of a feat to pull off. It did have its ups? Yes, it did. Did it also have its downs? Yes, it did. It was a very up and down season for me. Like I said, I like the first 3 episodes, and these final 3 episodes aren't the best, and this ending is problematic for several reasons, like I've just said, but it is indeed an ending, and I'm very curious if there were I heard that there were multiple endings. I'm really curious to see what those endings were. Were they better than the ones that we got? Perhaps. I also really and, going back to a little writing problem, if you're gonna have someone end up on the throne, write him better. Not better, but, like, make his character more fleshed out. You know what I mean? Bran had this literal physical journey throughout the series that got him to a certain point, and then I felt that they just didn't take that next step forward with Bran. I know a lot of people don't like his character because we thought we were getting more from him and we never did. So that's something that's problematic. And there were a lot of other things that we thought we were going to get more of and that we just didn't. And I think that a lot of that was a product of not having the time, and perhaps it was a product of them not knowing where to go or being unsure of how to fulfill certain things. I'm not really sure. I'm not the people who ran the show. But like I said, it's an up and down show for me. Overall, when it comes to the entire series, I don't think it's a complete loss. Yes, it is disappointing, and one can make the argument that it is disappointing when you had so much buildup. You had so many expectations, which is probably one of the downfalls of having a show on this level is you have all of these expectations and people want to see something that probably ultimately couldn't have been done anyways. You know what I mean? Like our expectations were really, really high for this series to end. We were expecting greatness, and what we got was significantly less than that. So we are even more disappointed because of it. But overall, I don't think the whole series is a loss. It's a very interesting ending to for some reason, but I always like to look at these things with some sense of objectivity, some sense of hope, some sense of positive and negative, because we're living in a very gray world and the things we're consuming are also very gray. There's nothing that is entirely great or is entirely bad. It's a mixture of both. And I think we can have this argument, not argument, we can have these conversations, and everyone is entitled to their own opinions. I'm not saying my opinion's better than anyone else's or is the right opinion. It's just how I feel. And I don't particularly hate what they did with the series or how they ended the series. I think they had a very difficult job and they did the best they could. Ultimately, several disappointing factors kind of played out. So with all of that being said, I won't keep you guys here for much longer. Please check out all of the other videos I have here on my channel, and thank you all for joining me on this journey through the last season of Game of Thrones. It is finally over. It felt like it just started, but now we are here at the end, and that is all. That is it. Until next time, bye.